The kamikaze pilot stands silently, absorbing the weight of the mission before him. He's already taken part in the rituals that countless others have completed before him. His hand trembles as he writes a final letter to his family. He mutters one last prayer to his gods. He makes his way toward his aircraft, casting an eye over the plane that will deliver his final flight. Before he climbs into the cockpit, he pauses, carefully strapping on his helmet. Wait, why would a pilot on a one-way mission need a helmet anyway? This is just one of the many bizarre details about kamikaze pilots that await on this episode of The Infographic Show. Did you know that the kamikaze pilots got their name from a natural disaster? The name translates to divine wind in Japanese, and the origin dates back to the 13th century. Then Japan faced off against the mighty Mongol Empire. The forces of Asia's largest empire were massing, sending a fleet to the islands. And then, a massive typhoon struck the Mongolian fleet head-on, devastating it and stopping the invasion in its tracks. The Japanese leaders saw this as the work of the gods, and they thought to recreate this success with the sacrifices of their countrymen. And the pilots weren't the first time the Allied forces faced these kinds of attacks. Everyone's heard about the kamikaze flights, but have you heard about the Bonsai charges? This strategy first showed itself in the battle for the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, as the Japanese forces were rich in manpower but short in weapons. So they simply attempted to overwhelm the American forces with charges, while screaming, "Tenohaika Bonsai," or "Long live the Emperor," to indicate their loyalty even while facing death. This low-tech attack caused massive casualties on both sides and became known as the human wave attacks, a strategy still being used by the Russian military to wear down the Ukrainian forces today. But if they don't expect to come back, what's up with the helmets anyway? Kamikaze pilots had a simple goal: to survive long enough to fly their plane into the most high-priority target possible. This would often be American ships loaded with soldiers and valuable weapons. The explosion would ideally send the entire ship down to Davy Jones's locker, exchanging one Japanese life for a massive blow to the US military. But these ships were often highly guarded, which meant that the kamikaze pilot needed to pull off some tricky moves to get to their target, which means they needed to stay conscious up to the last moment. The helmet the pilots wore was simple, not like the fancy modern ones we have in Top Gun. They were actually more like leather flight caps that protected the head, keeping the pilots from suffering from high-altitude cold or hearing loss. This is because airplanes then often had open cockpits, especially ones you knew would fly only once. The planes also had a ton of turbulence and would need to make some high-speed turns, which could result in the pilot bouncing into the roof of his plane. So the helmet was an essential piece of equipment to keep the pilot safe. Well, until he very much wasn't safe. But the helmet wasn't the only important equipment on board. This was the kind of mission where you only got one shot at it. When the pilot flew into the target, they would go up in a fiery blaze and hope to take the ship with them. The pilot wasn't surviving either way, so Japanese officers would usually boost their odds of success by loading the plane with some explosive cargo. Either extra fuel that would create a more powerful blaze, or actual explosives that would detonate inside the ship. The result was a surprisingly successful operation that the US struggled to understand, because they were key at one of the war's deadliest battles. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days and involved more than 240,000 total soldiers and more than 100,000 civilians. The longest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater, it also saw the heaviest use of kamikazes, with the doomed pilot striking repeatedly in the middle of intense combat, killing up to 5,000 men. It's believed that this is the worst damage ever inflicted on the US Navy during a single battle, and the legend of these pilots was used to fire up the Japanese soldiers as they continued their war. But would you believe that it all might have started by accident? The roots of kamikaze pilots were actually found at the very start of the war. During the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, one attacking pilot, Lieutenant Fusata Aida, took heavy fire from US soldiers and his plane was going down. Rather than try to land and be captured, he motioned to his group to proceed with a bombing run, while he took aim at the base's largest hangar, hoping to take out a whole group of planes. Unfortunately for him, his plane was ripped apart by ground fire and it never hit its target. But his countrymen no doubt took some stories of him back to their home country, and an idea was born. And in the middle of the war, there were definite advantages to using kamikaze pilots. Japan had one of the most loyal armies in the world, with the population viewing the emperor as chosen by the gods and themselves as tiny parts of a much larger battle. What they didn't have was all the resources they needed. By this point, they were largely embargoed by most of the world, and their allies in Germany had their own war to win. So the use of kamikaze pilots allowed Japan to use aging planes that had mechanical issues, stripped of much of their machinery so they could carry a larger explosive payload. After all, the plane only needed to make a one-way journey. But this brute force tactic wasn't as simple as it appeared. Many of the kamikaze flights never hit their target. This was due to mechanical failure and because the US learned to look out for planes getting ready to dive bomb. One pilot, Takahiko Ina, survived to his 90s because his kamikaze planes kept failing on him before his final arrival. 3 times, usually resulting in an emergency landing. Many other planes were shot down, with under 20% of them hitting an Allied target. Despite this, though, the attacks were still incredibly deadly. 47 Allied ships were sunk by them, while hundreds were damaged. And they had another purpose for the Japanese army: propaganda. The kamikaze took on a mythical quality when used to fire up the troops, and the commanding officers made sure they had a good story, even if it didn't match reality. The planned kamikaze flights didn't take off until the 1940s, but as soon as they did, there were dramatic tales. That was definitely the case for Arima Masafui, an air commander who participated in a kamikaze mission in the Philippines. He never reached the aircraft carrier Franklin, being shot down by US troops, but that didn't stop Tokyo from reporting that he had perished heroically and promoted him to the rank of vice admiral. And for those chosen for this doomed deed, some odd things awaited them. For one thing, it was one of the shortest terms of training for any specialized mission. Pilots would be selected, and then they would go through only 40 hours of training before they were put in the cockpit. Most pilots were young, and they were only taught the basics of evading enemy fire and picking the right target. This is compared to the up to 500 hours of training other pilots would get, and to fill in the gap, the doomed pilots would often be escorted on their missions by more experienced pilots. And how the pilots got there would vary dramatically. For many of the kamikazes, it was presented as the highest form of duty to the Japanese Empire. Filled with fervor, they would volunteer, and this often brought some unique honors, like a visit from the Showa Emperor personally. But as the war went on, other pilots found themselves pulled out of standard duty and assigned to kamikaze duty. And the few who survived report that despite what they might have said at the time, they were terrified to die. Not dying because of mechanical error meant that you got to try again on the next mission. But that might have been the better scenario, because if a kamikaze pilot survived due to a failed mission or, God forbid, cowardice, they would be considered the lowest of the low. Not only would they be ostracized by their fellow soldiers and likely face severe military consequences, but they would be considered a disgrace by their countrymen when they returned home. And that's if they weren't accused of desertion and executed. And before they took off, there was a ritual they followed. Before taking off, the kamikaze pilots would have a light meal of rice, drink some sake, and they would be given medals and a katana sword to take with them in the plane. They would also carry some of their beloved possessions, with the idea being that these would enter the afterlife with them. And they would write a letter to their family, laying out their last will and testament, as well as encouraging them to view their sacrifice as something heroic. These letters were often used as propaganda by the government. They would also have a little reading material in the cockpit. Each pilot was given a manual when they took off, telling them what to do in various circumstances, like letting them know to return to base in bad weather if they can't locate the target, so they can try again in ideal conditions. Besides practical advice, the pilots were given more philosophical readings about how to disregard their earthly life and focus all their will in the mission, and to find peace in the fact that their mission was the highest calling. Cheery reading material right before death. But there was one thing no kamikaze pilot was prepared for. A surprising number survived. Few of these were due to quitting their mission or failing it, but rather due to mechanical failure, with some going out multiple times and having to return each time. Others were lucky due to the end of the war in 1945, with Kazuo Odachi joining the military at 16 years old and flying several key missions in the Philippines and the Pacific Theater. The young man was ultimately part of a group of 30 planes on a kamikaze mission in the last days of the war, ordered to inflict as much damage as they could. They were about to take off when they received an order to return to base for an important message. That message turned out to be the Emperor's surrender. The young man, who was only minutes away from death, has lived to 97 years old and is one of the very few remaining kamikaze pilots who can tell the story of what it was like to be on a true one-way mission. Want to know more about what it was like to be one of the unfortunate soldiers who returned in disgrace? Check out What If Kamikaze Pilot Survived, or watch this video instead.